Infrastructure is an artifact. It's physical or even sometimes intangible structures. But there's a process whereby we produce infrastructure. And this process is one that inevitably involves working together. There are many things we can do as individuals where we can take the initiative, we can do things on our own, we can innovate, we can strive, we can be ambitious. Economists sometimes refer to that as the market activities. It's a little bit narrow if you think about all the ways in which we strive and innovate and try to achieve something on our own. But there is this other domain of things where we can't do it on our own. We have to work together. And if we don't work together to create the frame, the structure that goes between, the infrastructure that lets us connect with each other, if we don't work together to create that, then those things we do on our own will come to naught. They won't help us as individuals move forward. They won't help us collectively move forward. So the group level activities, the common activities, the things we have to do together are extremely important to support those other things that we do alone. And economists, frankly, have emphasized too much the market side, the individual side, the side where selfishness can be an advantage for a community. I think we've underestimated the importance of the other side, the side where we work together. And on that side, it is important not just to be smart or ambitious or strong, but it sometimes is also important to be nice. We have to work together to be considerate of each other and to be humble sometimes, to recognize that we do not always know the answers, that we will not always get what we want, but we commit to those collective activities, knowing that we're all affected in that same way. None of us can be sure of getting what we want exactly. None of us can be sure that it'll come out the way that we think is the right way to do it. But we have to commit to that process because otherwise we don't have the communities. We don't have the shared infrastructures. We don't have the ways to connect with each other. And it's the connections with each other that really make us all productive and capable of innovation and able to live out our ambitions. My early work on technology or knowledge that drove long-term progress, drove economic growth, emphasized this very basic point that we all benefit from each other. The reason humans have been so successful, the reason we've made progress, is because we can share ideas with each other. And those ideas translate into the technologies, the discoveries, the things that have improved the quality of life. So unless we're willing to commit to those group level activities that make it possible for us to connect with thousands or millions, or in some cases billions of other people on the planet, unless we make that commitment to the humility and the shared values that are required for the collective decisions, we won't be able to pursue the individual decisions, and we won't be able to sustain the progress that humans have sustained for so long and that we benefit from to such an enormous extent. Now, I think economists have de-emphasized the collective side of decision-making, the collective side of social interaction, partly because it's hard. We know it's hard now. We see that it's hard every day with the animosity, the polarization, the vitriol into public discussions about what we will do collectively. One of the points that this lecture reminded me of, preparing for it reminded me of, is that this is not new. We have always had problems making collective decisions. And that's a reminder that it is hard, and that we should not get discouraged by the fact that it is hard. We should not get discouraged by the fact that it seems like it's harder now. It may not be harder now because it's always been hard. We should just keep in mind that the benefits from that kind of connection are so enormous that we must keep struggling to work together, because the benefits outweigh the difficulty. But in so doing, we should, and here I think when I say we, I mean economists, we should talk more about the things we can do to help a little bit that collective decision-making process, to encourage us all to be a little bit nicer, and to celebrate and hold up as a model that kind of personality trait at the same time that we talk about ambition and success and the other things that are more individualistic. Now, this recognition that it's always been hard came out of a quest I started on as I was preparing this lecture, because I wanted to understand the street where I live. Streets are one of the most important types of infrastructure. Streets are the connecting mechanisms for us. We move along streets to see other people. We send packages to each other. Every pipe, every wire that we use to connect up with common systems is conveyed to us through the street. So I thought, let me just learn a little bit more about the history of the street I live in, because it's part of the history of New York City, which I knew it was historically a very important example of collective decision-making. So if I could have the first slide. What this shows, and it will be hard to see the detail, but what it shows is a picture of Manhattan in about the early 1800s. On the left edge, you can see the parts of the city that were already built. The rest of this is a map that someone drew. It was a committee of 3 people, although it looks like it was really one person who was the driving force on this committee. This is a map that someone drew saying we could establish streets throughout the entire island, the streets and avenues. And if we did that, many more people could live in this city. Perhaps as many as 1 million, they thought, which was an astonishing number in the United States in the early 1800s to even contemplate. It could grow to as many as 1 million people. This person, this visionary, was named Gouverneur Morris, and he was part of a process to build out the entire island of Manhattan, to help Manhattan succeed relative to Philadelphia, which was the other candidate for the major port in the United States, the major commercial hub. And the way they went about doing this was to first survey the island, see what was there, then to draw these lines on a map and then say, these represent the streets and avenues that people will use decades, centuries into the future. The upshot, if I could have the, oh, let's see, I'm in charge of the next slide. What the surveyors then did is go out and put posts in the ground, like this one that you can see here, out in the middle of a field, and say, well, this is going to be the intersection of, and I'll just make this up, 79th Street and 6th Avenue. The reason this one still exists is it was placed in Central Park. They did not anticipate the building of the setting aside of all of this land for the park, and because it became the park, the roads were not built at this location, and the post still sits there. But in most of the island, there were places like this with iron posts put into the ground, and plans that eventually, maybe decades later, streets would be built. Now, the success of this project, you can tell, partly comes from the fact that they were working with a relatively clean sheet of paper. The island was mostly farmland, it was undeveloped. They didn't have to go through the very contentious collective decision-making process of deciding, well, what if we move this existing street, or what do we do about these existing buildings? It was largely a clean slate, and that made it easier, but we never work with a truly clean slate. There were existing buildings, there were farm buildings, there were houses people had built, there were some roads that people had built. And so there was a contentious process that had to be resolved for agreeing on where the new streets and roads could go. This plan was announced in 1811, but for decades before that, people had been talking about plans for building out New York City, and that process could never come to any conclusion. So the state of New York appointed this commission of 3 people, of whom Gouverneur Morris was the key actor, and the state said to that commission, you have the responsibility and the authority for deciding where the streets will go. So they surveyed, they drew some lines on the map, then they went out and they put posts in the ground. Now this was, in its time, a very contentious thing. They had, in one sense, resolved the difficulty of how do we decide by giving the decision to 3 people, but of course, everyone affected by these decisions did not necessarily feel very happy about agreeing to the decisions that these 3 people made. Part of why these posts are so heavy and big, these big metal posts driven into the ground, is that the farmers who owned the land didn't like the fact that somebody came in and just put a post there and they took them out of the ground. And they called the local sheriff. They had the surveyors arrested. It was a very contentious process back then. Now, to zoom in a bit on the place where I live, we're going to focus on just past the boundary between where development had already taken place in New York and where this new development would take place. This new development was characterized by this very rigid rectangular grid. So you know the new parts of New York that built up after this plan was published. It's known as the Commissioner's Plan of 1811. You know the parts built according to that plan because they're part of the grid and they have the numbered streets and avenues. The earlier part of the city is, of course, less rectangular, more a bit of a jumble. And the part I'm focusing on here is the interface between those 2 places. If I zoom in a bit more, what this shows is a combination of the lines that were drawn saying this is where, in this case, 2nd and 3rd Avenue will go. But it also shows with some red lines that look like they've been added in pencil, it shows some existing streets that were there in this part of Greenwich Village when they went out and did the initial survey. If I zoom in just a little bit more, you'll see at the top it's 3rd Avenue, if you know New York City. In the middle, we have 2nd Avenue. Where the black arrow is about on top of 9th Street. The next street up is 10th Street. So between 2nd and 3rd Avenue on 10th Street is actually where I live now. You can see from this map that there were some existing structures. The black arrow points to a house that was built in 1804, so it already existed. It was on Diagonal Street, at least diagonal compared to the grid, that was called Stuyvesant Street after the farmer Peter Stuyvesant who lived in that area. The house is called the Stuyvesant Fish House. It was built for one of the family members of the Stuyvesant family. You can also see that down a little bit to the right and lower relative to the house, there was the church that is still there called St. Mark's in the Bowery. If you go to the church, you'll see that it is aligned on the true north-south directions, whereas, as you may know, the avenues and the streets in New York are not, or in Manhattan, are not on true compass coordinates. So the church already existed, the house already existed, but yet the plan called for these new streets and avenues that would basically force all of the existing houses to be torn down. Now, as I said, this was a contentious process. Somehow, some process had to be worked through to decide, do we stick with the plan? Do we tear down the houses that are already there and somehow compensate the people that have had to have their houses destroyed? Or do we make an accommodation? Now, the Stuyvesant family was relatively influential and powerful, so it's not a big surprise that this is one of the places where there was a compromise in the city relative to the plan. If you look, and again, it may be hard to see from the very back, but if you look at a current map of this area, you'll see that Stuyvesant Street persisted. It was not wiped out by the grid. 9th and 10th Street were built. 2nd and 3rd Avenue were built. Many of the other houses that were on that map when the survey was first done were torn down. But the black arrow actually shows the location of the Stuyvesant Fish House, which still exists. The blue marker highlights the church, by the way. And so this is the picture of Stuyvesant, the Stuyvesant Fish House as it exists today. So through some process, and I don't know all the details, but through some process of political negotiation, protest perhaps, argumentation, who knows, bribes, some process was worked through that led to a compromise that preserved Stuyvesant Street for a little bit more than a block, and preserved the Stuyvesant Fish House, but yet let the other streets be built and let all of the development that could take place in New York City actually go ahead and take place. Because the Stuyvesant comes in on an angle, this forms one of these triangular kind of intersection points in New York City, where Stuyvesant is coming in from the left, and 10th Street is on your right. I guess the other just bits of the local geography to show you are Stuyvesant ends when it hits 10th Street here, and then they've created a small park in front of St. Mark's because there was a little triangular bit of area where the street actually used to go through. They stopped the street there and turned it into a park. There's a woman who lives on my block who was instrumental in making that park happen. So that this process of compromise and adjustment over time continued through the 20th century. It was in the late 20th century, about 40 years ago, that she forced the city to make this into a park. I don't know exactly how it had been used before then. It may still have been road surface area. But within the frame of something like the plan, the commissioner's plan for New York City, and within the process of compromise where some owner of a house, like the Stuyvesant Fish family, could influence what actually happened, there was room as well for citizens to express their voice, to work hard, not just through electoral mechanisms, but by pressuring people, holding people to account to the law, to do things like create some public space, which is available for everyone to use. Now, it's part of this story that of this woman, Caroline, that I met, that I described in the very beginning, had lived in New York City for many years before I met her, and she had often walked through this corner part of the city and always thought to herself that this would be the place. If she ever could live permanently in New York City, this would be the place that she would want to live. Because of the triangle, because of the intersection, it's a little bit more open. It's also a very residential street. It's a very pleasant street. Now, the connection I want to make to broader public policy is that this decision, the reason I moved to New York was because I wanted to understand the decision-making process that led to the grid, that led to the working out of all of these compromises, and then created a city where 1 million, then 10 million people could live, because we need to replicate that process all over the world. There are billions of people who don't yet live in cities, who want to live in cities. And there was a model for how to create livable cities that emerged from this history that I went to New York to learn about and study. By acting first and saying, this is where the streets and the avenues will go, just drawing them in on the map, saying, this is where 5th Avenue or 6th Avenue or 42nd Street will go. These three commissioners created options for the government, for the public sector, to do something with this public space as the city developed. By acting first, before the city had become fully urbanized, it set aside the public space that now provides the ground where those pipes and those wires are laid, and the sidewalks where people walk, and the bikeways where we can now bike. They set aside in 1811 the space that would be available to the public to decide what they want to do with through the decision-making process of their government. It was a really astonishingly far-sighted decision, I remind myself every time I look at this that when the Commissioner's Plan of 1811 was published, and they said Fifth Avenue will be here and it will be wide, they didn't even know what a bicycle was. But yet they knew somehow that this extra space given to the public sector could facilitate a better quality of life for people in the city. They didn't know how the collective decision-making process would decide to use that space, but they knew it would be valuable, and they made it possible for the public sector to make those decisions. So when, for a time, there were elevated railways on these public spaces, those were taken down. Then we had more automobile traffic. But over time, we've adjusted. We've used those streets for bike lanes now increasingly. We've used them for outdoor seating for restaurants during COVID. But the beauty of this story is that the government had a significant amount of public space where it could make decisions about how to use it as the world evolved and changed in New York City. The problem I and other people at the World Bank faced when we thought about something like urbanization in the developing world is that we were repeatedly presented with the case of development which had taken place first, favela, informal type development, where there had been no process that set aside public space. So when the pressure built, when the city grew and people's income grew and opportunity grew, and there was a natural need to go in and do things like put in a water main, put in a sewer pipe, start to establish a sewer system to protect public health. Because this development had taken place first, before anyone set aside the public space that would give future governments options, it's extremely expensive to go in and try and do anything like put in a water pipe, put in a sewer pipe, create a road that a bus could go down so that people who want to get their first job could take a bus to work. All of these things are extremely difficult to do, extremely expensive, but difficult for the reasons I alluded to in the beginning. There's so many stakeholders, there's so many people who have to agree if you're going to make a change, that trying to put in the infrastructure after the development has come, after that market process, that decentralized market process that economists like to celebrate has played out, if you try to provide the structure second, you make the challenge almost impossible. We estimated that this center that I was running at NYU, that if the developing world could do what New York City had done and just say, before the development takes place, let's just set aside the land that we'll need when it comes time to build a sewer or lay a water pipe or create a busway. If we just set aside that land first and then say to people, don't squat on, don't take the land, which is the public land, but either through private rights or squatter rights, however it happens, you can develop the land which is defined by the public space. If we could just reverse that order, we could save a factor of 10 in the cost of infrastructure. What's expensive about infrastructure is not the concrete or the work that goes into building it. What's expensive is this process I've described of getting people to decide together. So knowing that that process is so hard, we argued that there was a sequencing decision. We still argue, and we're still trying to make this argument to the rest of the world. If you just reverse the decision-making process and do what they did in New York, set aside the public space first, reserve that for the control of future governments, and then tell the private sector, go ahead, pursue your market-like ambitions, do what you want to do, with the blocks that are defined by this grid of public space. So this was the initiative we have been pursuing, and ideas like this take time to percolate through the policy sphere. Many people feel that urban development is a cancer, that urbanization creates slums. It does in fact create favelas without water and sewer and public services, without access to buses in many cases. But that's because governments are trying to stop it. They think it's a problem. If they just switched their view and said, urbanization is opportunity, let's do it right, and then sequenced it the way New York City did, they could cut through a lot of this difficulty that comes in collective decision-making, save some room for the government and the collective decision-making process to make its decisions as the world changes, but yet turn over the rest to the private sector. By the way, the quantities here are not trivial. In Midtown Manhattan, about a third of the land was set aside as this public space, this grid. And this is without even counting parks. It takes a lot of public space to make all of those connections. But if you create that public space, the value of the private land that is left, the private landowners could say, well, you've taken away 2/3 of our land, but the value of that private land is 10 times, hundreds of times, thousands of times greater because of the connections and the interactions that are made possible by the public space that you set aside in the beginning. So if you set aside that generous public space, many things that are beneficial can happen. We also, in making this policy case, tried to push back on a presumption that by setting aside the opportunities for connection, you also have to plan all of the details of the connection. So in a few cities in Colombia and Ethiopia where we encouraged city leaders to carry out this kind of process, in the empty land, the undeveloped land around the city, people would ask us questions like, where will the schools go? And we said, you'll figure that out later. Where will the fire hydrants go? You'll figure that out later. Every question they asked us about, don't we need to plan for this? Where will the commercial spaces go? Where will the residential spaces be? How do we let them work together? You'll figure that out later. We tried to encourage everyone to just do what New York City did and know that you're going to be working in an environment like designing Fifth Avenue when you don't know what a bicycle is. Just set aside the public space and then wait and see. And you'll find that the connections you can make through that grid will be very valuable. And all the other details you can resolve without the complexity of getting everyone to agree on where the grid goes. So we think that this is really the future of urbanization, and that building new communities, communities like the one here that the Chautauqua Institution has fostered, communities like even Burning Man, which is a place I've studied, as a community which comes into existence and then goes away each year. The one thing they do at Burning Man is specify, here's where this public space is. This is the streets. This is where the streets are. They put stakes in the ground and say, you can do whatever crazy thing it is that you want on the land that you can occupy, but don't mess with the public space that will make it possible for 70,000 people to interact with each other when they arrive each year at Burning Man. So we've had some success in getting people to think differently about urbanization. One of my colleagues who really drove this work, a man named Solly Angel, has kind of labeled the program here the Making Room agenda. We have to make room for people to move into cities. And we have to do that, frankly, even in the United States, where it's gotten too expensive for many people to move into a city to live and work. But we especially have to do it in the developing world, where there's so many people who still want to move into cities and who can't. So this notion of making room as the agenda and expanding the built area of cities to allow more people to move into them, this is starting to make some headway. It's starting to influence public policy discussions, and it's starting to even show up in cities that are doing things like charting an expansion area for themselves that is one where they plan, as New York City did, for the public space before the city comes, before the development takes place.